The summer of 1991 began like any other in Wichita, Kansas. The sun burned wide and flat over the prairie, the kind of heat that made the asphalt shimmer and cicadas buzz like static. The Harrisons lived in a modest two-story house on a quiet street, where neighbors still borrowed sugar and waved from porches. Paul, 40, a veteran who now worked maintenance at a grain elevator, was known as dependable, the sort of man who could fix anything with duct tape and a wrench. Linda, 38, taught second grade and kept their home orderly but warm. Fridge covered in drawings, laundry always folded by Sunday night. Their children gave the house its sound. Jamie, 12, wore baseball caps backward and was never far from his Walkman. Sarah, 9, collected postcards, though she had never been out of Kansas. She taped them above her bed, little windows into other places. That June, Paul suggested a trip west. A few days in Colorado Springs, mountains instead of wheat fields, a reunion with David Morales, an Army buddy Paul hadn't seen in nearly a decade. They packed light, a cooler with sandwiches, cassette tapes for the drive, Sarah's favorite stuffed rabbit, Jamie's glove, and ball. The plan was simple. Leave Wichita Friday, cut through Oklahoma, stay a night in Texas, then swing north into New Mexico and up into Colorado. A long weekend, back by Wednesday. The last confirmed sighting came at a Texaco station outside Amarillo, late Saturday morning. It was the sort of place with buzzing fluorescent lights and a hand-lettered sign about restrooms for customers only. The attendant remembered Paul asking for directions toward Santa Fe, his voice polite but tired. Linda used the payphone by the ice machine. She called her sister in Topeka. "We're fine," she said. "The kids are happy. We'll be in the mountains soon." Her sister heard Jamie laughing in the background, then the click of Sarah saying something about postcards. It sounded like any other family road call, ordinary, forgettable. They pulled out of the lot in their Dodge Caravan, blue with a strip of sun-faded paint on the side. It was 11:17 a.m., hot wind stirring dust across the road. No one saw them again. By Monday evening, Morales had set out paper plates in his Colorado Springs kitchen, barbecue already cooling, children from his own family waiting to meet Uncle Paul. He waited until the food went cold, then longer, pacing from window to driveway, checking each set of headlights that slowed on his street. Finally, he called Wichita. When Wichita police took the report, they treated it first as a delay. Cars break down. Families take detours. But when neither Paul's employer nor Linda's school heard from them, and when no charges appeared on their bank cards, the tone shifted. By Tuesday night, New Mexico State Police were alerted. Patrols drove stretches of highway. Troopers noted mile markers, scanned culverts with spotlights, checked bridges where accidents sometimes went unseen. Nothing. No skid marks on asphalt. No debris field suggesting a rollover. No reports of a broken-down van abandoned by the road. The vehicle hadn't been towed. Rental agencies confirmed no drop-offs. Credit cards, silent. Checking account, untouched. It was as though the Harrisons had slipped out of their seats and dissolved into the heat rising from the highway. For Linda's sister, the silence made no sense. She replayed the call over and over in her head. She sounded happy. She said the kids were laughing. How does that turn into nothing? She drove stretches of highway herself, stopping at motels and diners, showing a Polaroid of Sarah holding the rabbit. No one recognized the child. No one remembered the family. By the following week, the search expanded. The volunteers on horseback combed dry gullies. A helicopter traced the roads between Amarillo and Santa Fe, its blades chopping the desert air. Officers stopped truckers, asking if they had seen a blue caravan with Kansas plates. Reports came in sporadically, always vague, always unverifiable. One man swore he saw the van at a rest stop, but when pressed, admitted it could have been another one, same color. Back in Wichita, their house stayed frozen. School projects still hung on the fridge. Jamie's baseball glove lay on the porch where he'd tossed it the day before they left. The grass kept growing, but no one inside opened the curtains. Neighbors whispered, but no one had answers. When a reporter asked a sheriff's deputy what he thought had happened, the man shook his head. It's like they drove off the road and just erased themselves. By the end of June, the search had drained resources. New leads dried up. Families of the volunteers returned to their own lives. Diane's sister kept calling New Mexico stations, asking if maybe they had checked the right stretches, if maybe the van had been mislogged. But she heard the same rehearsed lines. We've done all we can. The map stretched from Amarillo to Santa Fe like a wound. 170 miles of asphalt, gas pumps, diners, motels, and desert. Somewhere in that distance, 4 lives had disappeared. And on Monday evening, in a Colorado Springs kitchen, the barbecue was cleared into the trash. Plates washed, table wiped, a space at the end still set for a family that never arrived. Just wondering, where are you watching from? Write it down, Bello. The search for the Harrison family began with urgency and collapsed into confusion. By Wednesday morning in June of 1991, law enforcement from Kansas, Texas, and New Mexico had pooled resources. Patrol cars idled on shoulders, dust rising from their tires as troopers leaned against hoods with binoculars. Helicopters swept low over the highway, blades whipping hot wind across the desert floor. From above, the road looked endless. Gray ribbons stretched taut across scrubland and canyon. The first theory was mechanical failure. A van that had swerved off the asphalt rolled down an embankment hidden from sight in a wash. Officers were told to check every culvert, every ravine. They leaned out of helicopter doors with spotlights. Volunteers rode horses along dry creek beds. Nothing surfaced. No skid marks, no shattered glass, no oil leaks painting the sand. When the vehicle didn't appear, theories shifted. Runaway, voluntary disappearance, a family wanting to start fresh. It was easier to believe than the alternative, that 4 people had been plucked off the map. But people close to the Harrisons dismissed the idea instantly. Linda's sister drove the roads herself, knuckles white on the wheel, looking for anything. An abandoned cooler, a stuffed rabbit, a scrap of clothing. She found only dust and silence. She told reporters through tears, "Linda called me the day they vanished." She was happy. She wasn't running from anything. Meanwhile, tips began to swamp the hotlines. A farmer near Tucumcari claimed he saw a van matching the description leave the main road and head into the desert around noon on Saturday. He wasn't sure of the license plate. Could have been Kansas, could have been Oklahoma. Deputies drove out and found only tire tracks overlapping dozens of others in hard-packed sand. A woman at a Greyhound station in Santa Rosa swore she heard a child call Mom from a passing van that slowed near the lot. She described a girl's voice, young, desperate. But she couldn't say the color of the van or even if it had Kansas plates. She was the only one who heard it. Each tip was written down, logged, weighed against time stamps. Each dissolved under scrutiny. The Harrisons' faces soon appeared on flyers stapled to power poles and taped to convenience store windows. Jamie's grin beneath a baseball cap, Sarah clutching Jenny the rabbit against her chest. The words, "Missing Family." Last seen near Amarillo, printed in black across the top. Truckers carried the flyers from state to state, tacking them to corkboards in diners. But recognition never came. In Brookfield, Kansas, neighbors gathered in the Harrisons' kitchen, casseroles left untouched on counters. Tom's brother tried to keep the yard trimmed, as if neat grass could guard the home. Linda's sister refused to touch the children's bedrooms, believing that if they came back, the rooms should look exactly as they had the morning the family left. Inside Sarah's classroom, her desk still held an assignment she had written days before. "When I come back from our trip, I'll write about the mountains." The paper stayed pinned to the corkboard above her chair until autumn, when the teacher, crying, finally packed it away. Weeks passed. The case bloated with rumors. A drifter arrested in Arizona claimed he'd seen a van buried under brush. Deputies searched, found nothing. A truck stop cashier in Raton said a boy with a Kansas accent bought candy with a crumpled bill. The description never held up. Each false sighting burned hope, then smothered it. The media latched on, turning the Harrison case into a summer obsession. Anchors called it the family that vanished. Nightly newscasts opened with aerial footage of desert highways and reporters standing beside maps. Residents of Amarillo complained of helicopters at night, lights sweeping over roofs like search beams in wartime. By September, the search officially scaled back. Resources shifted to newer cases. Files were boxed, labeled, and slid onto shelves. Investigators moved on, even as they admitted nothing about the Harrisons fit a pattern they could recognize. For relatives, there was no moving on. Linda's sister drove the same stretches for months, scanning ditches until her vision blurred. She told a reporter, "Every patch of sand looks like it could hide something. Every shadow looks like them." She slept in her car at truck stops, waiting for headlights that matched a Dodge Caravan. When the anniversary came in June 1992, vigils were held in Wichita and Colorado Springs. Candles lined church steps. Photos of Sarah and Jamie yellowed in the sun. Speeches were made about family, about loss, about answers that never come. And then, slowly, the story faded. Headlines shrank. Flyers curled in the weather until rain stripped them from poles. Other disappearances filled the airwaves. The Harrisons became another mystery. People nodded about at coffee counters, then forgot as soon as they left the diner. By the fall of 1992, investigators used the phrase that froze the family in place: suspended, presumed deceased. The official report was 1 page long. No remains, no vehicle, no belongings recovered, circumstances unknown. But in Wichita, the empty chairs at Thanksgiving told a story louder than any report. Neighbors drove past the house on Elm Street, windows dark, lawn untrimmed, as if the building itself had gone into mourning. No trace, no grave, no goodbye, just a family erased between Amarillo and Santa Fe. And then, 16 years later, in a Dallas auction yard, a black Chevrolet Caprice rolled onto the block. Dusty, battered, with government stickers peeling from the windshield. No one in the crowd could have guessed that inside its trunk, under the spare tire, a secret had been waiting for more than a decade, one that would rip the Harrison case open again. By 2007, the Harrison case had become a memory with dust on it. For 16 years, the files had sat in municipal storage boxes, edges yellowing, notes fading into carbon smudges. New detectives in Wichita barely knew the name. Families who had lit candles at vigils no longer gathered. The house on Elm Street had been sold, stripped of toys and photographs. Then, in Dallas, an auction changed everything. The city held regular sales of vehicles seized in narcotics busts and forfeitures: old sedans, pickup trucks with dented beds, motorcycles with half-missing fairings. That August, Under a sun that bleached the asphalt pale, buyers gathered to walk rows of metal. Lot 42 was a black 1980s Chevrolet Caprice, once used as a government pool car, then parked in an impound for over a decade. It was unremarkable. Dust film on the windshield, cracked vinyl seats, odometer stuck at 142,000 miles. A local mechanic bought it cheap, planning to strip it for parts. He drove it onto a flatbed and hauled it back to his shop. 2 days later, working through the trunk, he pulled the spare tire out. Underneath, wedged against the wheel well, was a package. Clear plastic sheeting had been wrapped tight around a metal tin, taped at the seams as though to make it waterproof. The mechanic thought at first it was drugs long forgotten. He cut the plastic and opened the tin. Inside was a child's sneaker, faded canvas, laces stiff with age. Beneath it, the small round shape of a skull. Delicate, jawbone missing, size unmistakably juvenile. Next to it, a stack of Polaroids, rubber banded together. The photographs stopped him cold. Each showed children in the back seat of a car. Blinds were drawn tight across the windows. Flash glare bounced off glass. In some frames, the faces were turned, half in shadow. But details pushed through. A boy with a baseball cap, brim bent backward. A girl clutching a doll with yarn hair and a chipped nose. Their eyes carried that stunned stillness children have when they know they must not move. The mechanic called the police. By nightfall, the Caprice sat behind tape, trunk open, evidence bags filling with items that no one could explain. When news broke, Wichita's phones rang before sunrise. Linda's sister saw the broadcast on her kitchen TV, dropped her coffee, and sank into a chair. "That's them," she told the reporter, who came an hour later. "That's Sarah and Jamie. Older, but that's them." The FBI sent agents. The photos were scanned, enlarged, compared against the Harrisons' school portraits from 1991. Experts noted the resemblance: jawline, freckles, hair texture. Most chilling was the timeline. In the Amarillo flyers, Jamie was 12 and Sarah was 9. In these Polaroids, the boy looked closer to 14, the girl nearly 11. The implication was brutal. The children had been alive, held somewhere, long after the day the world thought they vanished. Dental records confirmed the skull was not Sarah's. It belonged to a girl aged roughly 7 or 8 at time of death, but not enough bone remained to extract DNA. The shoe was child-sized but weathered beyond dating. The Caprice's chain of custody only deepened the riddle. Records showed it had been seized in a Dallas narcotics operation in 1994. It sat in a police lot until 1997, when paperwork transferred it to the city auction program. But for reasons no clerk could explain, the vehicle had never been put up for sale until 2007. 10 years of dust and silence. Detectives demanded to know, how could evidence tied to a missing family sit unnoticed in the trunk of a city-owned vehicle? Theories bloomed like weeds. Some believed a corrupt officer had hidden the tin deliberately, assuming it would vanish in the shuffle of seizures. Others speculated the Caprice had changed hands informally before impound, carrying secrets no one wanted logged. None of the scenarios ended with a clean answer. For the Harrison family's relatives, the photographs cut deeper than any speculation. One image showed Sarah's hand curled tight around Jenny the rabbit. The doll looked grimier, ears bent, but unmistakable. Linda's sister pressed her own copy of Jenny against the newsprint image, tracing the same flattening at the nose. "She was alive," she whispered to cameras. "She was alive after we stopped looking." The public devoured the details. Nightly news ran grainy enlargements of the Polaroids, blurring the children's eyes, but not enough to erase recognition. Talk radio buzzed with theories: cartels, child trafficking, secret relocations. People asked why a van could vanish on a clear road in daylight, and why the first real evidence had surfaced 16 years later. Miles away in the trunk of a sedan, no one connected to them. In Wichita, the old house at Elm Street became a shrine again. Strangers left flowers at the steps. Some wrote notes, "We remember you." Others pressed Polaroid film cartridges on the porch, as though giving back what had been stolen. The FBI confirmed only this: the photographs were genuine, taken with cameras manufactured in the mid-1990s, which meant the Harrisons' children had been alive for years after their supposed disappearance. The skull, the shoe, the photographs, each artifact pointed toward survival, captivity, and something darker. And in Dallas, investigators cataloged one last detail from the Caprice. Taped under the lid of the tin was a scrap of paper. Half the ink had blurred with time. But one sentence survived, jagged in handwriting that leaned hard to the right. They never made it to Colorado. If this story touched you, even a little, let me know in the comments. We read them all. The Caprice evidence forced the Harrison case out of its coma. What had once been a missing persons file gathering dust now stood in front of cameras, reporters crowding microphones, officials shifting in their seats. Dallas police held a press conference 3 days after the discovery. The spokesperson was careful, her voice rehearsed. The child's sneaker, she confirmed, was consistent with the size worn by a 9-year-old girl. When pressed, she admitted the measurement lined up with what Sarah Harrison would have been wearing in 1991. But she refused to go further. Then came the skull. Forensic anthropologists at the state lab concluded it belonged to a child between 10 and 13 years old. The range made it possible, just possible, that it was Jamie. But DNA was compromised, too degraded by time and exposure to confirm. Every journalist in the room heard what wasn't being said. It could be him, but they could never prove it. For the Harrison relatives, that ambiguity was unbearable. Linda's sister flew to Dallas, clutching printouts of the Polaroids. At a small meeting room in the station, she spread the photos on the table, pointing, shaking. "Look," she insisted, tapping the image of the boy. "That mole near his jawline, that's Jamie. He had it since he was a toddler. You don't forget that." Her voice cracked as she moved to Sarah's picture. And the way she holds Jenny, you can see she's trying to hide behind it. That's Sarah. That's them. How can you sit there and say maybe it's other children? The detective across from her leaned back, arms folded. His reply was flat. Resemblance isn't confirmation. Until DNA or direct identifiers say otherwise, we cannot state that's the Harrison children. The room went silent, except for the sisters' ragged breathing. The family hired attorneys. Press conferences shifted tone from grief to outrage. How, the lawyers demanded, could such evidence surface in a car that had been in government custody for over a decade? Why had the tin been overlooked through multiple inventories, auctions, and transfers? Who had access to that trunk, and when? Public records unearthed a troubling fact. The Caprice hadn't just been a generic seizure. It had been confiscated in 1992, barely a year after the Harrisons vanished, during the arrest of a man suspected of trafficking. He was never charged. Case dismissed, paperwork citing insufficient evidence. But his car stayed impounded, and inside it, apparently all along, were artifacts that now pointed back to the missing Kansas family. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore. Reporters dug into the man's background. His name wasn't released publicly, but leaked fragments described connections to interstate trucking and property holdings near rural highways. Whispers of prior investigations that never reached indictment. A name that had once appeared in the margin of an FBI memo, then disappeared in redaction. Dallas officials deflected, insisting the car had passed through multiple custodians and chain of evidence was not preserved. They didn't explain why records showed the vehicle sitting untouched for years. Meanwhile, the Polaroids circulated in newsrooms. Grainy enlargements showed Jamie's bent baseball cap, Sarah's freckled cheeks, Jenny the rabbit clutched tight. Experts debated on air, child psychologists, photo analysts, retired agents. Some said the body language was unmistakable. Children in captivity. Others cautioned against wishful identification. The public, though, needed little convincing. To them, the Polaroids were proof. The Harrisons hadn't vanished on the road. They had been taken, held, photographed. And somewhere along the line, evidence of that captivity ended up in the trunk of a car, tied to a man no one wanted to talk about. In Wichita, the case returned like a storm. Old neighbors, now older still, stood in driveways, shaking their heads. Some said they always suspected foul play. Others admitted they'd believed the family ran away, until now. Candlelight vigils reignited. New flyers were printed, this time with stills from the Polaroids next to the school portraits. Beneath the images, the word "still" missing. The contradiction cut deep. Were Sarah and Jamie alive in those photographs, or had the images only captured the last trace of them? The questions piled faster than answers. Why had evidence been hidden or overlooked for more than a decade? Who placed the metal tin in the trunk? Was the skull Jamie's, or another child entirely? Why did the car, linked to trafficking, sit dormant in government lots instead of being processed? And, most pressing, if the Polaroids showed the Harrisons alive years after their disappearance, where had they been kept? The official investigation moved slowly, tangled in bureaucratic caution. But outside the station, pressure built. Independent journalists dug through property records, archives, and auction logs. One of them, an investigative reporter named Claire Douglas, received a phone call late on a Friday night. The voice on the line was distorted, rough, as if passed through fabric. It spoke only a few sentences. "You're wasting your time with the car. Look at the land. Who bought acreage off Highway 287 in '93? That's where your story lives." Then the line went dead. Claire sat at her desk, phone still pressed to her ear, the hum of the dial tone in her head. She pulled a map of Texas highways from her drawer, traced the line of Route 287 south of Amarillo, and felt the story take a darker, sharper shape. The anonymous call pointed straight toward land records, and that's where journalist Claire Douglas began. At the dusty counter of the Randall County Clerk's office, she asked for deeds along Highway 287 purchased in 1993. The clerk rolled her eyes but wheeled out a cart of ledgers, their spines cracked and smelling of mildew. Claire ran her finger down columns of names, dates, parcels measured in acres. There it was. April 1993. A 40-acre plot registered to a shell company dissolved 3 years later. The signing agent? The very man whose caprice had once sat impounded in Dallas. The property lay 20 miles south of Amarillo. Scrubland mostly, flat horizon, mesquite, rusted wire fencing. When Claire and a private investigator she'd hired drove out in a dust-coated sedan, the gate was hanging open, chain cut long ago. Tumbleweeds clung to the wire. At the center of the land sat a battered trailer. The aluminum siding had buckled in heat, windows covered with sheets of plywood pocked with holes. The investigator, a former deputy named Rivas, forced the door with a crowbar. The hinges squealed like an animal. Inside, the air was thick, sour with mildew and old smoke. Their flashlights swept across cracked linoleum and piles of discarded junk. And then, Small things that didn't belong to abandonment. On the floor near a cot lay a torn blanket patterned with cartoon characters from the early 90s. Its colors had faded, but one square showed a grinning dinosaur Sarah's age group would have adored. Beside it, half buried under dirt, was a Game Boy, its screen spiderwebbed, buttons still stiff when pressed. Claire picked up a photo album with its cover ripped away. Inside, plastic sleeves held photographs ripped out, only scraps left behind. Edges of faces, corners of landscapes. Someone had deliberately torn it. Her flashlight caught the wall above the cot. Words had been carved into the paneling with something sharp. Maybe a pocket knife? Uneven, frantic letters read, "Here we waited." The trailer creaked in the wind, wood panels shifting as though sighing. Claire felt her throat tighten. This wasn't a squatter's den. It had been lived in by children. Behind the trailer, Rivas's boot sank into softer ground. He crouched, brushed away soil, and found fragments of bone. Small, brittle, some charred at the edges. They called the sheriff's office, who sent deputies and a forensic team. By lantern light, technicians sifted the shallow pit, laying fragments onto a tarp. Early whispers suggested they were human. Age, identity, impossible to say yet. But the fragments carried weight heavier than any confirmation. The discovery rattled Amarillo. News vans parked along the access road, their cables running across dirt. Anchors spoke in hushed tones about possible remains. The phrase hung like smoke. For Linda's aging mother back in Wichita, the confirmation of her dread was unbearable. When a reporter asked what she thought, she whispered, "I always knew they didn't just vanish. Somebody kept them. Somebody hurt them." Yet the trailer gave more than bones and echoes. In a cabinet drawer, under a pile of stained newspapers, Claire found a VHS cassette. The label on its side, scrawled in marker, 1993. Family. The plastic was sticky with age, the reel inside loose. She sealed it in a bag and carried it straight to investigators. The sheriff's office didn't announce it publicly right away, but word leaked. The tape showed a vehicle matching the Harrisons' Dodge Caravan parked beside that very trailer. Figures visible through grimy windows. 2 children. A woman. A man. Alive. Even before the video could be stabilized or authenticated, the existence of the cassette confirmed what had long been suspected, but never proved. The Harrisons reached this land. They were here, held for reasons no one yet understood. Claire replayed the words cut into the wall in her notebook. Here we waited. She wondered who had written it. Sarah? Jamie? Both? Carving time into wood because no one came? The discovery reframed everything. The skull in the Caprice. The Polaroids. The tin taped shut. It was no longer the story of a family that disappeared. It was the story of a family that was taken, transported, and held. The highway hadn't swallowed them. Someone had. By the time investigators loaded the VHS into evidence, cameras crowded outside the sheriff's office. Reporters shouted questions. Was this linked to trafficking rings in the 90s? Was law enforcement complicit? How could such a property have been ignored for so long? The only official response came from a press officer with nervous eyes. All evidence is under review. We ask the public not to speculate. But speculation was already wildfire. And inside a locked evidence locker, a VHS tape sat waiting, its spools carrying images no one was prepared to see. The VHS cassette labeled 1993-Family was sent first to a state lab for stabilization. The tape itself was brittle, the oxide layer flaking, every second of handling a risk of erasure. Technicians cleaned it carefully, then spooled it into a machine patched together from salvaged parts. the kind only archives still used. When investigators gathered in the darkened viewing room, the air smelled faintly of warm plastic and ozone. The screen flickered, gray static giving way to an image blurred but unmistakable. A Dodge Caravan, blue, dust clinging to its sides. The Harrison van, parked beside a trailer, the same one Claire and Rivas had opened years later. The camera wobbled, as though handheld by someone impatient. It zoomed abruptly, bringing the van closer. Through the glass, faces. Paul in the driver's seat, head bowed, hands clenched on the wheel. Linda in the passenger seat, her face turned away, but her posture rigid, like someone bracing against unseen weight. In the back, Jamie and Sarah. The boy pressed against the seat, arms crossed tightly, his baseball cap shadowing his face. Sarah clutching Jenny the rabbit against her chest, small shoulders hunched. Even through the static, the image was heavy with fear. Then a voice, male, out of frame. "Smile. You're at your new place." The camera pushed closer. Paul turned his head, jaw tense, eyes locked on the lens as though trying to memorize the face behind it. Linda finally looked up too, and her lips moved. Technicians slowed the tape later and swore she whispered, "Please." The lens shifted deliberately to the children. Jamie stiffened, his chin lifting in defiance, a boy's attempt at control. Sarah, though, broke. Tears streaked down her cheeks. Jenny was held so tight, her little arms bent at odd angles. The voice came again, low, mocking. "Say hello." Neither child spoke. Sarah's sobs filled the silence. Then, without warning, the recording cut to static. The rest of the reel was blank. The room was silent when the lights came back up. Detectives shifted in their seats. One muttered, "Jesus Christ," under his breath. For investigators, the tape was more than grotesque. It was confirmation. The Harrisons had survived their disappearance. They had been transported to that trailer, held under watch, filmed by someone who treated their terror as spectacle. The existence of the tape explained the Polaroids. It tied the artifacts together in a way no theory of random abduction could. But it left darker questions. Who was behind the camera? Why preserve the footage at all? And why leave the cassette behind, decades later, in the ruins of a trailer? Outside the evidence locker, the effect was immediate. Families of other missing children demanded their cases reopened. Advocates pointed to the tape as proof of systemic negligence. The Dallas PD, already under scrutiny for the Caprice debacle, now faced accusations of covering up leads for decades. And for the Harrisons' surviving relatives, the tape tore open wounds too raw to name. Linda's sister collapsed when shown the images, screaming that she had begged police to search further back in 1991. "They were alive," she cried. "Alive, and nobody came for them." The FBI confirmed the tape's authenticity, but withheld it from public release. Even grainy stills leaked to the press were enough to haunt anyone who saw them. Sarah's face, wet with tears, Jenny's yarn hair clutched in her fist. Claire Douglas, the journalist who had traced the property, knew the discovery put her under a new kind of watch. She kept her blinds drawn. Her phone began ringing with hang-up calls at odd hours. Then, a week after the tape surfaced, an envelope arrived at her newsroom desk. No return address, no stamp, just dropped off. Inside was a single Polaroid. The image showed the same family seated inside what looked like the trailer. The lighting was dim, the children older by months at least. Jamie's hair had grown longer, Sarah's cheeks thinner. Paul and Linda sat close together, holding hands, their expressions resigned. On the back, scrawled in the same jagged handwriting seen on the scrap of paper from the Caprice tin, were 4 words. They didn't all leave. Claire stared at the sentence until her vision blurred. It wasn't just evidence. It was a message, a taunt, proof that someone still wanted this story alive, or wanted to control the way it was told. The cassette had shown the Harrisons alive. The Polaroid suggested that, when they finally vanished again, not all of them disappeared together. But which one, or ones, remained? By the fall of 2007, the Harrison case had become too volatile for silence. The Caprice, the trailer, the Polaroids, the tape. Each artifact pointed not to a random disappearance, but to a sequence, a pattern. And then, out of the half-light of memory, a new voice appeared. He was 70 now, a retired mechanic who had once worked in the vehicle bay of the Dallas County Jail. His name was kept out of the papers at first, but investigators knew him as Harold Dwyer. He had followed the headlines with a frown that deepened every time a new piece of evidence surfaced. Finally, he called the tip line. When detectives met him in his small bungalow outside Mesquite, he slid a cigarette from a pack but never lit it, just rolled it between his fingers. "I remember that Caprice," he said, nodding slowly. "We had it in the jail garage around 92 or 93. They told me to replace the trunk lock, said the original had been busted." He paused, eyes narrowing. "I asked why a car under evidence needed a new lock. One of the deputies laughed, said, 'Don't ever open that trunk. That's the past in there.'" The words chilled the room. Dwyer described more. While working near the car, he noticed a cardboard box on a workbench. Inside were what looked like children's clothes, tiny sneakers, a dress with cartoon prints, a stuffed toy with one ear missing. When he asked what it was doing there, an officer shoved the lid closed. "Evidence!" the man snapped. "Don't ask questions." To Dwyer, it felt like warning and threat rolled together. He never spoke of it again until the Harrison case roared back into the headlines. The implications were explosive. If Dwyer's memory was right, then artifacts tied to missing children, maybe the Harrisons themselves, had been in police custody as early as the mid-90s, which meant evidence had been buried, literally and bureaucratically, for over a decade. Journalists leapt on the story, hungry for confirmation. Officials deflected. "Aging memories can't be taken as fact," one spokesperson said, but for families of the missing, Dwyer's account rang truer than the polished denials. The question hung heavy. Was the Dallas Police Department complicit in covering up what happened to the Harrisons? For the Harrison relatives, it was unbearable to think that salvation might have been possible, that Sarah and Jamie could have been found alive in 1993, if only someone had looked. It was then that a federal investigator working with Claire Douglas confided something that shifted the ground again. In dusty FBI indexes from the mid-90s, he found reference to a case labeled only Unidentified Female Minor. 1995. The file described a girl discovered during a raid on a suspected trafficking safe house in New Mexico. She was estimated to be about 12 years old, malnourished, and unwilling, or unable, to give her real name. But the file ended abruptly. The case number linked to no further documents. In the early 2000s, the record vanished from the digital system altogether. When Claire asked why it was relevant, the investigator lowered his voice. "Because the age matched. And because I've seen a photo, blurry, low quality, from the intake. And the resemblance to Sarah Harrison is hard to ignore." Claire pressed him. Could she see it? He hesitated, then slid a photocopy across the table. The image was grainy, photocopied a dozen times, the face smeared with shadow. But the outline of the jaw, the curve of the brow, the faint freckles, Claire felt her throat close. It could have been anyone, but it could have been Sarah. The revelation left Diane's sister in tears. "All these years, I begged them to keep looking. she whispered. If that was Sarah, if she was right there in their custody, how could they lose her again? The tension around the case grew suffocating. Law enforcement circles muttered about rogue units and compromised officers. Families of other missing children began to wonder if their sons and daughters had crossed the same hidden pipeline. Dwyer, the old mechanic, repeated his memory to anyone who would listen. The phrase wouldn't leave him. Don't open that trunk. There's the past in there. And in a locked archive box, a blurred intake photograph waited, carrying the shape of a face that might have been a Harrison child. A face that might have belonged to a girl who was supposed to have vanished forever. If she lived, the question was obvious. Who had taken her in? And why had the records disappeared? And if she hadn't, then what story did that photograph tell? And who was determined to bury it? The deeper investigators pressed into the Harrison trail, the more it twisted into other disappearances. The trailers south of Amarillo, once dismissed as an isolated hideout, proved to be a hub in a chain of abductions across Texas and New Mexico in the early 90s. Files surfaced of missing children whose names never left county borders. Girls taken from schoolyards in Lubbock. A boy vanishing from a rest stop near Tucumcari. 2 siblings last seen at a county fair in 1992. Their cases had gone cold, marked as runaways or unresolved stranger abductions. Now, mapping them out, pins on the board formed a crude arc that curved straight through the territory where the Harrisons were last confirmed alive. It wasn't random. It was a corridor. Investigators cross-referenced property deeds, trailers, storage lots. Again and again, the name of one man returned. The same trafficker whose Chevrolet Caprice had carried the Harrison evidence. He had died in 1998 in prison on unrelated charges, a heart attack in the medical wing. At the time, no one linked him to missing children. Now his shadow hung over every lead. But the worst discovery wasn't his alone. Through public record requests, Claire Douglas uncovered a trail of communication between the trafficker and an officer in the Dallas Police Department. Handwritten notes, a shared P.O. box address, unexplained bank deposits that never matched salary. It wasn't definitive, but it suggested what no one wanted to say out loud. Someone inside law enforcement may have helped shield the network. Claire put the question to a retired detective who had worked Dallas Vice in the 90s. His reply was quiet, almost ashamed. Back then, some cases weren't supposed to go anywhere. You learned which files to leave in the drawer. If you asked too many questions, you got reassigned. Or worse. The implication landed like a hammer. The Harrisons may not have been lost because of incompetence alone. They may have been disappeared into silence. Then came the package. It arrived at Linda's sister's house in Wichita, delivered by standard mail, no return address. Inside was tissue paper wrapped around something soft. She opened it with shaking hands and gasped. It was a doll. Old, worn, its cloth yellowed with time. Yarn hair frayed, the chipped nose. Jenny, the same toy Sarah had carried everywhere, though dirtier, thinner, eyes loose in their sockets. On its back, stitched fabric had been cut open crudely, and in the lining, someone had carved a word with a razor blade. Sarah. A date had been written in ballpoint ink on the doll's leg. Ayiratu tolayiratu tonutru aru. She collapsed in the kitchen, clutching it, wailing that it was proof her niece had survived years past the night they disappeared. Forensic testing later revealed nothing useful. No fingerprints, no DNA. Whoever sent it knew how to leave nothing behind but pain. When the story hit the news, the effect was electric. Talk shows debated whether the doll was authentic or a cruel hoax. But for the family, the detail was too sharp. too intimate to be coincidence. It wasn't just a doll. It was Sarah's identity sewn into fabric, used as a weapon decades later. The doll also underscored a more terrifying fact. Someone still alive, someone who had touched Sarah Harrison's belongings, had access to them in the mid-90s, and still had access now. Detectives traced postal cameras, but the trail vanished in a blur of generic clothing and gloves. Whoever mailed the package knew surveillance. When asked for comment, one senior investigator finally admitted what no official had dared say publicly. This means one thing. Whoever did this is still watching. Maybe the same people who took her. Maybe someone who knows where she ended up. But they want us to know the case isn't finished. The revelation tied the Harrison disappearance into something larger, a chain of abductions hidden in plain sight, protected by silence, punctuated by cruel reminders that the victims were never forgotten. At least, not by those who took them. And somewhere in the evidence, in the photographs and the grainy VHS frames, in the stitched name on an old doll, one truth pressed closer, unbearable. Sarah may have survived. But if she did, the more frightening question wasn't where she went, it was who decided she could live when others didn't. By winter of 2008, the Harrison case no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like exposure of a wound the system had tried to keep stitched shut. Journalists had pried at the caprice, the trailer, the tape, the doll. Each revelation pointed away from random chance and toward deliberate design. Still, no one was prepared for what surfaced next. It came from a police evidence vault in Dallas. A young clerk, tasked with digitizing old case files, found a thin envelope wedged between folders. Inside was a folded map of Highway 287, stretching from Amarillo toward Wichita Falls. Along the margin, someone had written dates in black marker. Each date corresponded to a missing person report from the early 1990s. And halfway down the map, in thick letters, one entry stood out, 07.1993. Harrison's, pinned like a notation, as though their disappearance was not a singular tragedy, but part of a schedule. Claire Douglas received a photocopy from her source. She stared at it, sick to her stomach. It wasn't just geography, it was logistics. Every mark lined up with a case once dismissed as a runaway, a stranger abduction, a family gone astray. The map suggested coordination, almost like a ledger. When she confronted a retired FBI analyst, he didn't deny it. "We'd heard rumors," he admitted. "There were whispers about a corridor, children taken along predictable routes, but no one upstairs wanted to call it organized, because organized means accountable. It means someone had to be looking the other way." For the Harrison family's relatives, the horror landed like a second death. They had prayed for answers, but not like this. Their loved ones weren't an accident. They were a line item on a calendar. The discovery redefined the case. It was no longer only about one Kansas family, but about dozens of children across the Southwest, linked by mile markers and dates. Claire dug further, tracing the handwriting. Forensic comparison suggested it matched the same hand that had written on the scrap of paper in the Caprice tin. They never made it to Colorado. Whoever kept the ledger had also left trophies, messages, reminders, a person or network that wanted control even decades later. Then came the final envelope. It arrived at the newsroom, addressed in block letters, "No return address." Inside was a single photograph, glossy and recent. A young woman sat on a park bench, holding a toddler on her lap. The child's face was visible, but the woman's was partially obscured by her hand as she brushed hair from her eyes. Even so, the resemblance was unmistakable. The freckles, the slope of the nose, the familiar outline of her jaw. It looked like Sarah Harrison, grown into adulthood. On the back, in the same jagged handwriting that haunted the case for months, was a message. They haven't forgotten. Claire's hands trembled as she held the photo. If it was authentic, then Sarah had survived. She had escaped the fate implied by bones in shallow graves and names on maps. But if she had lived, why had no one spoken? Who had raised her, hidden her, allowed her to carry a child of her own into a world that believed she was long dead? Law enforcement responded cautiously, as they always did. "The image may be doctored," a spokesperson said. "We cannot confirm identity." But in private, investigators admitted the photo had metadata suggesting it was taken only months earlier in a park south of El Paso. For Linda's sister, the picture was both salvation and torment. "If that's Sarah," she whispered to reporters, "why can't she come home? Who's keeping her from us now?" The implications circled back to the darkest possibility, that Sarah had been one of the children spared, allowed to live, perhaps even absorbed into a life constructed by those who had stolen her childhood. The map, the tape, the doll, all pointed toward a machinery bigger than one trafficker or one corrupt cop. It was systemic, deliberate, stretching across states, stitched into highways and law enforcement silence. And yet, instead of closure, the family was left with a photo too recent to ignore and too terrifying to trust. In the end, the Harrison case never delivered the finality of a grave or a confession. It left fragments: a shoe, a skull, Polaroids, a videotape, a doll with a name carved into its back, a map of dates, and a photograph of a woman who might have been Sarah Harrison, smiling faintly as she held a child who had no idea of the legacy written into her mother's face. The last unanswered question was the loudest. If Sarah had lived, who else had? And why, after 16 years of silence, had someone decided to remind the world? They haven't forgotten? The silence after that revelation wasn't relief. It was terror. Because if someone could orchestrate disappearances so cleanly in 1991, if evidence could sit locked in police garages, if children could be turned into marks on a map, then perhaps the Harrisons' tragedy was never really over. Perhaps it was only a chapter. And the story still had someone out there writing the next page.